We've had a lot going on this morning. We're running a little bit longer than we usually do. And it's especially cruel on a week in which we're hosting our friends from the Reform Synagogue who don't do 3-hour-long services with Musaf. I want what you're having. So I brought a longer text study for us to do. What can I say? I'm cruel. No, we're going to look at this, but we'll look at this a little bit more briefly than I had anticipated. There's really one idea that I want to make sure to share this morning, and that's how our tradition has constructed the concepts of darkness and light. The Parsha that we read contains within it the 3 final plagues, the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness, and the plague of the killing of the firstborn. We're going to talk together a little bit about that 9th plague, the plague of darkness. If you see on the sheet that came around to you, the passage from the Torah, then God said to Moshe, hold out your arm toward the sky, so that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness which can be touched. The darkness that descends that day is a darkness which has physicality to it. It is the darkness of a sandstorm. It's the darkness, says Ibn Ezra, of an ocean fog. It's the darkness that is so thick that it blots out the possibility of light. Moses held up his arm toward the sky, and that thick darkness descended upon all of Egypt for 3 days. Lo ra'u ish ad achav, and a person could not see their brothers. And for 3 days, no one could move at all. Says Rashi, if you were sitting, you had to stay sitting because you couldn't even see to stand up. If you were standing, you had to stay standing because you certainly didn't know where the chair was. That people were frozen in stasis for these 3 days of deep darkness. But all of Israel enjoyed light in our dwellings. That a thick cloud descended over Egypt, such that one person couldn't make out the next, and in particular, that a person couldn't recognize their brothers. That's an interesting construction of darkness. What is the darkness that keeps us from recognizing our brotherhood, our sisterhood with one another? What is the darkness that is so obscuring that it becomes possible day after day in our country that someone picks up a gun and walks into a celebration of a holiday, takes a stand outside of a sheriff's department up north, can see people exiting a house of worship and not see fellow believers, but can only see enemies? What is that kind of darkness? It's not a darkness that's about the absence of light. You might notice that we got some new lights in here. It's a little brighter than it was before. It's not that kind of darkness. It's an internal darkness. It's a spiritual darkness. It's a darkness which breaks us one from the other. And it's a darkness that we all know all too well. This is a plague. This is an affliction. This is a punishment that's being brought against Egypt. For us, it's Tuesday. And Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and every day of the week, this is the reality that so many of us live with. Just the recognition that we have become so estranged from one another that such things are no longer surprising. They're tragically ordinary. And so how does our tradition construct darkness? It doesn't construct darkness as an absence of light. It constructs darkness as an absence of the capacity to recognize our interconnectedness. How then does our tradition construct light? Well, it constructs it as the very opposite. And take a look from a passage from the Gemara, from the Talmud at the bottom, where it says, what is dawn? This is a passage early in the first tractate of the Talmud, Tractate Brachot, which deals with matters of blessing. Tractate Brachot begins with a discussion of when you say the Shema at night, and then moves to a discussion of the Shema in the morning time. And it asks the question, what is morning? How do we define the time at which one can begin to proclaim the unity of God? From what time does one recite the Shema in the morning? From when one can distinguish between techelet and white, between the color of sky blue and the color of white. And Rabbi Eliezer says between blue and green. If you're not familiar with how Talmud works, this is how Talmud is laid out. Talmud is laid out in a series of Rabbi A says this, Rabbi B says that, Rabbi C says you don't know what you're talking about, Rabbi D figures out a way in which it all harmonizes back together, but then Rabbi E comes along and then there's a real problem. So there's going to be a lot of different definitions of what constitutes darkness and light. At the start of this discussion, there is a discussion about distinguishing between colors, particularly between the color of techelet and the color of white. Techelet was a sky blue dye that was used to dye a single thread of the tzitzit, of the ritual fringes in antiquity. We lost the secret recipe to techelet for many, many centuries. Techelet was derived from a particular kind of snail, and it's only actually in the last few decades that techelet snail has been identified, and you can now get real-life 2,000-year-old sky blue dye of the way that they were talking about. It's a light blue. It's very nice. It means that your tzitzit are about 50 times more expensive if you've got it. But the idea is, can you look down at your fringes and notice the difference between the colors? That means there's enough light that it's time to pray. And another rabbi comes along and says, sky blue and white, well, those are two pretty distinctive kind of colors. One is dark, one is light. Make it a little bit more light. Make it until you can tell the difference between the shade of blue and the shade of green. So you see what they're doing. They're just arguing over the fine distinction of how much light is enough light to constitute the beginning of the day. Is it enough to be able to tell between a dark and a light color, or to distinguish between two darkish colors? From what does it mean between techelet and white? It's between sky blue and the tzitzit and white and the tzitzit. Thank you very much. Rabbi Meir says, from when one can distinguish between a wolf and a dog, and Rabbi Akiva says when one can distinguish between a tame donkey and a wild onager. Is that how you say that? Thank you very much. It's a wild, untamable kind of donkey. So these two rabbis offer opinions that the distinction, the light that is sufficient for us to say that dawn has broken, is when we can distinguish a dog from a wolf, or a wild donkey from a tame donkey, when we can distinguish somehow between domestic and wild. And I think when we can in some way distinguish between friend and foe. A dog is a friend. A wolf is dangerous. A donkey is an essential work animal. A wild onager is one of those animals which, despite all efforts, has never been tamed. And I found it interesting when I was doing a little bit of research with this, that an onager is also the name used for a particular kind of Roman siege weapon, a kind of catapult. Rabbi Akiva, who was part of the great Bar Kokhba uprising, the uprising against Rome, which cost hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives, would have seen these things in action. He would have seen these giant machines of destruction come and level pieces of the walls of Jerusalem. So maybe the distinction here is to be able to make a distinction between friend and foe, between that which is safe and that which is very, very much not. And then a final answer. And others say, from when one can see a friend and know them from a distance of 4 arm lengths. When you're just a little ways away, can you look over and recognize your brother? And Rav Huna says the halacha is just so. After offering different explanations of what is the difference between light and dark, and considering the possibility that it might be about making a visual distinction between colors, or it might be about making a more important, even a life or death distinction between friend and foe, the ultimate conclusion that the Talmud comes to is, when do we know that dawn has broken? When we can see in another face our brother, when we can see in another face our sister, when we recognize our friends, that is when we have come to a moment of dawn. Darkness is constructed in a tradition as that which tears us apart. Light is that which allows us to see in one another's face a face of love, a face of friendship, a face of community. In these times in which we are divided from one another, in which the darkness feels so thick that we can touch it, it's our obligation to lean into the light, to find in each other's faces faces of love, and to make our face a shining beacon for others. Shabbat Shalom.